Okay, let's move on to a couple of examples of how this could work in practice. The first example I want to give involves collocates. So put very simply, a collocate is just a word which comes near or next to another word a lot more than you'd expect it to occur by chance alone. Now, I think you're having another session on collocates on Friday with Claire, so I don't want to talk too much about how collocates are created and the different ways of finding them out, because she'll talk about that. So I want to just stick really with that very brief example of what they mean and talk about why they're useful for discourse analysis. They enable us to identify very salient lexical patterns of association without having to read through hundreds and hundreds of concordance lines of a word. So they kind of give us a shortcut into our data and tell us what the most interesting kind of things might be there. They give us kind of a brief summary of the main points. They're also very interesting for discourse analysis in that they kind of tell us something maybe about ideological assumptions that tend to occur within language use. There's a really nice quote here by Michael Stubbs. He says, words occur in characteristic collocations which show the associations and connotations they have and the assumptions which they embody. And he gives a couple of examples. He has illegal immigrant as one and working mother as the other. And they both kind of illustrate different points. So illegal immigrant relates to a theory called lexical priming. This is the hypothesis that if we see two concepts or two words together a lot, over and over again in our lifetime, in lots of different contexts, we're eventually going to be primed to think of them when we just see one of them by themselves. So if we see, in newspaper, we read a certain type of newspaper, and we're seeing illegal immigrant every day in that newspaper, eventually, somebody like Stubbs would argue, or somebody like Mike Hoey, who has this theory, would say, if we see the word immigrant by itself, we're going to be primed to kind of think of the word illegal. It's going to kind of pop into our heads, even if it's not actually there on the page, because of all of these thousands and thousands of times that you've seen this phrase illegal immigrant together. So that may sort of lead you, kind of persuade you a little bit unconsciously to think of immigration as being associated with all of these illegal immigrants and not the ones who actually are legal. And so that can be quite a problematic thing to happen. The second example is slightly different. This is the phrase working mother. So these are the collocate working tends to collocate with mother, but we don't tend to see working father. This tends to be quite a gender-based and specific collocate. Now there's an implication embedded within this. Because it kind of occurs within that fixed phrase so much, it's almost like the word becomes like one word with like a hyphen in it. And when you kind of pack them together, it becomes harder to unpack the meaning apart. It becomes this kind of meaning which we tend to kind of crystallize and normalize in our heads. And working mother has an implication. It assumes that what mothers normally do, which is looking after children, housework, that's not work. Okay? That's the unmarked stuff. So it's only when you go out to a job and someone gives you some money for doing that job in an office or something, that's work. But the other stuff, is not work. And that's a problem, I think. Stubbs is saying here, if collocations and fixed phrases are repeatedly used as unanalyzed units in media discussion and elsewhere, it's very plausible that people will come to think about things in such terms. So as an example of how we're going to use collocates in discourse analysis, imagine we're going to look at discourses around gender and marriage. And this is some research I've done earlier. I'm going to look at the words bachelor and spinster. And just for this research, this talk, I'm going to just talk about bachelor. So this is the British National Corpus, which you'll be using in the second hour. And you'll probably be familiar with this type of screenshot because the BNC is using that CQP web interface that you would have used yesterday, hopefully. So I've done a search on the word bachelor, and I've just got put up there, I don't know how well you can see that, whether it's a bit too small, but it's the first 10 collocates, or the strongest 10 collocates of the word bachelor in the British National Corpus, which is this very large general reference corpus of 100 million words of just general English. And one thing sometimes I do with collocates, when I've got a list like this, is I can think about, do any of them actually collocate with each other? And we can think about the concept of maybe something called a collocational network, or an idea that all of these words collocate with bachelor. So if we had a diagram, we'd have bachelor in the middle, and then we'd have a line, sort of 10 lines going to each of them. But some of these words may actually collocate with each other as well. So sometimes it can be useful to get an idea of that and do that as a diagram. And I've got that up here. I had to do this by hand. There's not really tools at the moment that will actually do this. You have to work out the collocates of each one and sort of put them in a little diagram. And this sometimes gives you a better idea about the different meanings attached to a word, because sets of collocates that kind of collocate with each other suggest that there's a kind of set of meanings that are different from each other. So up on the right there, we've got words like education, science, arts, and degrees, which co-occur with each other. They collocate with bachelor, but they tend to collocate with each other as well. And that might suggest one meaning of bachelor, which is to do with, getting a degree. And we may want to discount that. We may say, well, actually, that's not the type of bachelor we're interested in, so we're going to ignore those collocates. They don't really interest us. Although I think if you look in more detail at the etymology of the word bachelor, you find that actually it is related to the idea of an unmarried man. When men were students years and years ago, centuries ago, it was the men who went out to study degrees. They tended not to be married, and that's where we get this bachelor later meaning coming from of the unmarried man. What else have we got there? We've got old and lonely, which collocate together as well, which may be suggesting some kind of other kind of representation which is made slightly more negative maybe of bachelor. We've got son and brother, which co-collocate, maybe suggesting bachelor's talked about in terms of family relations in some way. Maybe that's more of a neutral discourse, I don't know. And then living in flat, which may be indicative of the kind of lifestyle or living arrangements of a bachelor. One word which I haven't included in this, because it didn't actually collocate with any other words, though it was the top collocate of bachelor, was the word eligible. And I've just got a concordance here, because generally once we've looked at the collocates, the next stage is to go on to look at the concordance lines that have those collocates in and sort of do a close reading of each one to see actually what's happening, what context is this collocational pair occurring in. And I think it's pretty easy from this to see that eligible tends to occur before the word bachelor in a fixed phrase, the eligible bachelor, and generally an eligible bachelor is a good thing to be. It's kind of describing a quite handsome young man that lots of women want to marry. So you'd say, well, maybe that's a good, maybe to be a bachelor is actually quite a good thing because we've got this very strong collocate and bachelors tend to be eligible. But collocates only tend to pick on things that occur a lot, and it can be argued that maybe there are lots of other things going on in this data that maybe only occur once or twice, but they all kind of referring to the same concept or the same discourse. So I'd say as well as doing a collocation analysis, it's also good just to look at a concordance of the word bachelor by itself and run down each of those lines and see, are there any kind of patterns in there that can be grouped together? So are we finding other words with eligible, like handsome or attractive or things like that, which are kind of reinforcing this eligible construction, even though they only occur maybe once or twice and they're not coming up as collocates? So what I found is this instead. I think that's on your handout. And actually this goes against the idea of an eligible bachelor. These are not eligible bachelors at all. They're the opposite of eligible. They're hopeless in some ways. Let's go down them. We've got one which can't fry an egg or boil water, so they're kind of seen as a bit useless. And there's maybe an implication here that they need a woman in their lives to do these things for them. I don't know. The second one kind of reinforces that. They're hapless, they're scrounging free meals, because presumably they're not capable of making meals for themselves. Then we've got a few that maybe explain why they're bachelors. There's kind of this implicature within them. There's one who's quiet and modest and has a stammer, so maybe he's a bit shy and that's why he can't get married for. He can't put himself out there to find women. The fourth one's somewhat eccentric, so again, maybe this is why he's a bachelor. The fifth one, an old bachelor like him must be lonely, so we're getting this idea of lonely bachelors coming back from the collocational network. Another one which is an explanation possibly of why someone's a bachelor. They've got homosexual instincts, they're melancholy and prone to drinking bouts. And then some kind of ones which are kind of warnings almost in society. Maybe they weren't meant as warnings, but for me they function as, if you don't get married, a lonely bachelor who died in his bath has been found 4 years later. So it's like nobody cared about this poor guy, and he's a bachelor, and then he's been found in his bath. The horror of this. And that second to last one's, I think, my favourite one. Bachelor Brian Claydon, 59, found beaten to death in a lavatory at Nottingham Station with the glue for his toupee in a bag by his side. So there's all kinds of horrible kind of connections. The toupee, the beaten to death, the lavatory, Nottingham, all these all these kind of awful potential things, I don't know. Kind of reinforcing this very negative conception here of the word bachelor. And then the last one's very interesting too because of the implicature within it. This is a kind of a case of exception negating. Falconer was a bachelor, but a man in love with life. So The implication here is that if you're a bachelor, you aren't supposed to be in love with life. You're supposed to have a pretty miserable life. And if you look at those other ones, you can see why. You know, the expectation is bachelors don't have fun. So what's going on? We've got this table here. Then we've got eligible, which I showed you before, where they're all kind of attractive and people want to marry them. And I think what's happening is that we can say that they're different discourses, and they both kind of cohere together okay, though. I think it's okay to be a bachelor if you're young. And I think you get to a certain point, and then it's not okay. And then that's what you turn into. Yes?
What was the process for getting this title? Is it just a random slice of the book?
I looked at every bachelor, every concordance line of bachelor within the corpus, and I kind of grouped different ones together. Some I'd seen already, because I looked at the collocates. But these were ones which didn't come up as collocates, because none of these words were actually collocates. They were too infrequent. But they were all contributing towards this quite negative position. So I kind of grouped them by hand myself. And I think because they're from different texts, and there are kind of quite a few of them here, and not enough to fit on the page, but I think, there are a few, they're kind of saying similar things. There's a kind of negative kind of characterization going on there, as well as a potential positive one. So I think what's telling us is about marriage. It's saying it's okay for young men to not be married, to have fun, to be eligible, but get to a certain point, and you might want to think about settling down. And if you don't, there's a reason for it, and we have to explain why you haven't got married in this way, by either talking about these negative qualities that you've got when we mention that you're a bachelor, and then sometimes we talk about these awful things that can happen to you if you're a bachelor as well. Spinster's a completely different story. It doesn't follow this pattern at all. Spinster's always bad. So you don't get that little period of 10 years when you can have fun if you're a spinster. Okay, let's look at another example. This involves the concept of keenness. Is this something which was mentioned to you yesterday or not? Andrew Hodder said he might mention it if he had time. Okay, don't worry if you don't have. Tony McHenry is going to talk about it later, so you'll get a whole session on it again for 2 hours. So again, I don't want to kind of overlap with what he's going to talk about. So I'll just give you a very kind of brief explanation of what a keyword is. It's a word which occurs statistically more often in one corpus, or one text, or set of texts, when you compare the frequency of that word in another corpus. So you're taking into account the overall relative sizes of the corpora, and then the relative frequencies of those two words within them as well. And keywords are very useful. They're a kind of very useful corpus-driven way of doing analysis. I've argued that they kind of act as signposts. They give you a kind of way into the corpus. You have all these millions of words of data, and you just don't know where to start sometimes. And if you look at the keywords, you get maybe a list of about 20 or 50 keywords, and they're saying, these are the words which are really salient in this particular text or this particular corpus. And then you have to think, well, okay, why is that? Why are they salient? That kind of gives you a reason to look at these words in more detail. And we need to, we may see a word and think, I know why that's in there, but you need to examine concordances and collocates, look at the context of these words to see why they're actually appearing as key. So a study I want to talk about is something I did a few years ago, where I looked at a political debate which took place in the British House of Commons. This was now 10 years old, although it doesn't seem that way. And this was about whether or not fox hunting was going to be banned within the UK. It did actually get banned under Tony Blair's government. And I was quite interested in how people actually argued whether or not it should be banned or whether fox hunting should be kept during these debates that took place in Parliament. And I wondered whether there were differences within the language or the arguments that people use in order to kind of argue their different positions. So I thought a good way to kind of do this would be to collect the debates on fox hunting, and then compare the keywords. If I compared the people who are pro-hunting against all the people who are against hunting. So I got a corpus, which was all the speech in the debates that took place on fox hunting, about 130,000 words. So not really a very big corpus, really, but big enough, I think, for this sort of analysis. And if you're interested, you can get political data like this very easily from the Hansard website, where they just transcribe all of these debates. They're not always perfect in terms of the transcriptions. There are little errors and things, and people have written about that. But I think they're good enough for this sort of analysis generally. So then I had to split this in two by hand. There wasn't really an easy way to do this. I had to look through each of the speeches and think, is this pro-hunting or anti-hunting? And then I kind of copied and pasted it into a different file depending on whether it was pro or anti. And it was really easy to figure that out because people were very open and said what side they were on generally. So once I have these two kind of subcorpora, I then compare them against each other in order to get frequency lists for each one. So a frequency list is just a list of all of the words in a corpus and the number of times each word occurs. And then I use this keywords process, which compares the two frequency lists together, and it picks out the keywords, the words which are more frequent in one list when we compare it against the other. And here are some of the keywords which I got. These aren't all of them. I've just picked on some kind of interesting ones to kind of make some illustrative points. Just 10 for each side of the debate here. And one thing you might want to think about doing first if you do this type of analysis is looking at these words. I think it's okay to kind of guess at what they mean, although, as I said, it's always best to check looking at concordances and collocates of them too. But one thing sometimes I tell my own students to do, and I do myself, is maybe to group these words together if they seem to have similar functions, or even if they're just from similar grammatical groups. So even if you're not looking at a function analysis, but thinking, I'm going to put all the nouns in one category, all the adjectives in one category, things like that. So looking maybe at the ban hunting side, first of all, we've got words like clause, bill, and house. House tends to be House of Commons. So these tend to be quite procedural keywords relating to the debate itself. It's interesting. I'm not sure really why, and I still haven't found out why the people who want to ban hunting use these keywords more than people who want to keep hunting, but they do. Another interesting one is that word I for the ban hunting people. There weren't really many pronouns coming up as keywords. I think this was the only one that I found. And I was kind of wondering why people who want to ban hunting were more likely to use the word I. And I wondered if it's something to do with maybe they feel they're more able to personalize their arguments. I am fiercely opposed to hunting. That's okay to say that. Whereas if you were kind of arguing from the opposite position, maybe you're not. It may be a bit more difficult to personalize yourself into that kind of position. So maybe you use more abstract or passive sentence structures. I don't know. I haven't looked at that. This was something I was looking at this data again after about 6 years of analyzing it, and that's something that I thought about maybe doing. What about the keep hunting people? We've got references to names here, things like Garner and Liddington. These are names of people who were involved in this debate. The word Mr. comes up as well. Quite a formal way of address there. And I wondered if something's interesting happening here in terms of the formalization of language, maybe a more formal use of language by people who want to keep hunting. Although again, I'm not really sure why that's the case. And there could be, you need to look at that in more detail, and I haven't. We've also got some other words which maybe relate more to discourse of things like freedom, citizens, practices. Britain comes up, and that'd be interesting to look at as well. And so those are the things that I tended to look at when I was initially doing this analysis. The first one I looked at was barbaric, because that seemed like I thought, I know what that means, that's an easy win. And it was. And sometimes they are, and that's quite nice. So here we are. We've got a concordance of the word barbaric, a key word used by people who want to ban hunting, and you can see that they're saying hunting is barbaric, as simple as that. That's a very straightforward way of arguing the situation. You can maybe look at this in a little bit more detail. So what other words are occurring here? We've got words like cruel, bloodthirsty, obscene, unacceptable. So they're not just saying it's barbaric, but they're kind of emphasizing how barbaric it is by using similar words alongside barbaric as well. It's also quite interesting that the focus here is on the practice itself as being barbaric, rather than the people who are engaged in the practice. They're not described as barbaric generally. So these people who are arguing, they're not saying, hunters are barbaric, people who hunt are barbaric. They're talking more about the practice itself as being barbaric, or the sport as being barbaric. So this might suggest a strategy that they're engaging in to depersonalize the debate. They don't want to be seen as picking on individual people, because that's bad. So instead, they're kind of abstracting this to the practice rather than the people. Okay, on the other side of the debate, I looked at quite a few of the keywords of people who wanted to keep hunting, because their kind of discourse was a bit more complicated, I think, in some ways, than the other side, where they could just come out and say it's cruel, it's barbaric, don't do it. These are the people who had to do quite a bit more work in order to actually argue their position. I think because they were arguing from maybe the minority position by that point. Fellow and citizens were keywords, but they always occurred together, so I've just included them together to show that they occur in this kind of situation. These people were talking about Britain a lot. They're talking about the people of Britain. There's a kind of attempt here for these people to be saying that they're representing British values. They're representing what people of Britain actually think. So this idea of fellow citizens, these are my citizens, I'm part of these set of people. Let's look at a few lines. Line 11, first of all. Most of the 55 million people in England, this issue is of peripheral interest. So that's one thing. Line 7 talks about down the ages, we in Britain have fought against the persecution of minorities. So the kind of construction of Britain here is a kind of good place to be. It's a place which protects minority groups. It allows minority interests and practices to happen. It's a kind of nationalistic discourse, almost, you'd say, because it's drawing on this idea of Britain and Britishness and what does it mean to be British. And it's sort of arguing that if we pass this bill, that's not a British thing. Look at line 3. This is going to rob some of our fellow citizens of their livelihood. And this idea of freedom is continued at the bottom of the table if you look at lines 15 and 16. The idea of these restrictions upon freedom or restrictions on individual freedom. So I think it's difficult to kind of just look at one keyword here. You've got to kind of look at them and think of them as kind of operating as a chain connected together. Each of them are kind of, well, maybe it's a jigsaw, each giving a kind of piece of a discourse which kind of fit together to a bigger picture. A kind of related set of arguments about what it means to be British, that Britain is this great place, it's a place of freedom, it's a place that protects minority groups, and then this bill is then against these great values of Britishness because it restricts individual freedom in this way. And obviously this is only a very small part of the analysis. I can't go into a lot more detail because we don't have time. But they're in chapter 6 of the book on the 2006 reference on the handout at the end if you want to look at it in more detail. Okay, last example before we can maybe have a break. So this involves thinking more about techniques which are associated with critical discourse analysis, or CDA. Techniques that think about context in more detail, which can be quite hard to get to, I think, when you're doing corpus linguistics analysis. And I've co-authored a paper with people like Tony McHenry and Ruth Vodak talking about how you can draw on CDA and combine it with using corpus linguistics. And that's referenced on the handout as well. We have a model where we talk about shifting between corpus-based methods, corpus-driven methods, and then stepping outside the corpus and looking at context in order to develop and refine hypotheses for analyses. So this last example kind of draws on that a little bit. And this involves looking at something that's very important to CDA, which is this idea of intertextuality, the idea that texts can refer to other texts within themselves. And this can happen in lots of different sorts of ways. Intertextuality can occur if you have a text and you just mention another name of a text within that text. So I've been doing, typical lectures are intertextual because you're drawing on other people's references all the time. Intertextuality can involve actually quoting or re-quoting parts of a text, maybe a paragraph or a sentence from that text within your own text, and kind of recontextualizing it maybe for some other reason. Or you may be referencing a text in a more maybe indirect way. Maybe you parody a certain type of text. Or you paraphrase it or change the wording of it slightly as well, that sort of thing too. All of these are different ways of doing intertextuality. It can be quite hard to spot because you have to know about that other text before you can actually say, yeah, that's intertextuality. And if you don't know what the other text is, you can really miss it. And I know sometimes I think that's when sharing your analysis with lots of other people can help because they can spot things that you maybe don't know about society. And you can't really go through and Google every sentence in a text in order to kind of find out maybe it's intertextual or maybe you could, but it would take a long time. So I was quite interested in how do I get this idea of intertextuality? How do I use it in my own analysis to look at discourses? And the example I'm going to talk about involves looking at this corpus of newspaper articles that I had on Muslims and Islam. And when I first started doing the analysis, I thought, I'm going to take a very corpus-driven approach. I'm going to be very naive, or pretend to be naive, and pretend I don't have any hypotheses. I'm going to just look and see what comes out of the data. So I started off by looking at collocates of the word Muslim. So I thought, that's the group I'm looking at. I'm going to look and see what tends to co-occur with that word. And one verb collocate that I found was the word offend. So Muslims and offend occurred 744 times in my data. Also words like offence, offending, offended, they also occurred a lot with Muslim as well. So this kind of verb idea, or the concept of offence, occurred a lot with the word Muslims. And here's just a sample concordance. These are only a few lines which show this relationship between the concept of offence and the word Muslims. Now, there are lots of different possible ways that you can use these two concepts together. You can say, you know, Muslims are offended, Muslims are causing offence, or they're not causing offence, things like that. But when I looked at the concordances, what came out was that there's this idea that Muslims are being offended. They are kind of the people who are seen as having offence. And other people or other things are offending them. So they're taking offence a lot. They're not really offending other people. And some of these representations, if you look at them in more detail, seem to be quite negative. Particularly if we look at them in more detail, we see that they're constructed as taking offence over things which are often seen as quite trivial or silly or unimportant. So I started looking at some of these examples in more detail to sort of find out, you know, what's going on and why is this the case. And this often entails actually going into the articles themselves. Often a concordance line, it's okay for the gist, I think, but if you're doing a kind of more detailed kind of qualitative analysis, I think you really do have to sort of look at the paragraph or even the whole article itself and find out what's actually going on within it. So you have to, with the software that we're going to be using, you can click on maybe the word Muslims here, the word in red, and it will take you to the original text, and then you can read that in more detail. And that's often much more helpful. It takes a long time, but I think that's what you have to do, really. So I started looking at the last concordance line, change our way of life just to stop offending Muslims, they're never going to change theirs. Now, this was weird, because I thought this is not newspaper language. It's kind of text message or, I don't know, kind of, it's not language I would associate with newspapers, so I wasn't sure why it was in there. Maybe I thought it was a quote from somebody, but then why would they quote them using the number 2? And also, this kind of idea of offending Muslims, it came up in the same 3 texts. It came up in the same text 3 times. So I thought, there's a high proportion of offended Muslims in this particular text. I'm going to look at it. There's something weird about it, and it's occurring a lot. And this was the text itself, the whole text. It's actually a column from a letters page. Or rather, the Star newspaper doesn't do letters pages anymore. That's very kind of 20th century. So instead they have this thing called text maniacs. You can send in text messages as letters, and then they publish them as well. So that's why we have this strange use of text message language, the number 2 for the word 2 instead. So we've got things like people complaining about Muslims who seem to be offended by piggy banks for some reason. We've got, why should we change our way of life just to stop offending Muslims, in the first one. Second one, why do we have to bend over backwards so we don't offend the Muslim community? We can't even have piggy banks. And then the third one, Muslims are offended by our piggy banks. Then the £56 me and my wife and my 4 girls have got in our piggy bank to help the people in Pakistan will be spent on a fry-up, which is horrible. And it's kind of, you know, a very strong intention here, I think, to be confrontational against Muslims. So the question is, why are these 3 text messages all referring to piggy banks and Muslims being offended? And I wondered if it's usually the case. There's a kind of intertextual reference going on here. These people are kind of referring to another text within the corpus that maybe occurred in the newspaper the day before. And that's where I thought it was useful to carry out an additional search of the corpus, looking at words like piggy banks, to see whether or not there was this original article within the newspaper, or maybe another newspaper, to find out what it was about. So I've started off by being quite corpus-driven. You know, I'm looking at a collocate, I don't know what it's going to be, it's the word offence, and then I look at it in detail. And then I'm shifting here to a corpus-based approach, and I'm saying, okay, I found this example, I think it's happening because of some other article which is in the data. I'm going to do a search for that article looking at the word piggy banks. And here's the result of that search. There was an article the day before. I'll just read this out. Piggy banks are facing the axe because some Muslims could take offence. Britain's top high street banks have ruled that many bankers are politically incorrect. But last night the move sparked an outrage, that's one of their puns, and one of Britain's 4 Muslim MPs, Khalid Mahmood, said, a piggy bank is just an ornament, Muslims would never be seriously offended. Now what's interesting here is that this original article doesn't actually mention any Muslims who are offended by piggy banks. They quote actually a Muslim who says that Muslims wouldn't be offended, so they're kind of saying it's not something that Muslims would get offended at. What they're kind of saying here is it's the bankers, the people who are kind of making the rules, who are maybe the ones we should be picking on. So it's quite interesting that when we look at this text maniac column, the people who are texting in, they're not picking on the bankers. They've kind of misdirected their anger a little bit here, and they're kind of going on about Muslims being offended as well. You know, that last one, Muslims are offended by our piggy banks, that sort of thing. So this is a case where I think there's a kind of problem happening with the way that they're kind of quoting from these letters or text messages. Because particularly if you hadn't read that newspaper the day before and you've just seen this list of text messages, you may have got the idea that Muslims are offended by piggy banks. You may have got the wrong end of the stick here a bit, and that would have given you quite a negative impression of maybe what Muslims are like in terms of what they get offended about. So this is the case, I think, where investigating articles which refer to other articles in the corpus like this is very useful. It gave me this kind of surprise finding that I wasn't expecting that maybe they do this. Maybe that's naive on my part, and maybe that's something that everybody knows. But I don't read the stuff very much, and this was kind of quite interesting for me anyway. Okay, to end the first half with some concluding points. It could be argued that this combination of approaches to carry out discourse analysis will mean twice as many problems. And I'm going to talk about the problems more on Friday. But in a kind of maybe a more optimistic way, we could say maybe it gives us twice the strengths. It's still very much a developing field, and I don't think there are still not very many people who are doing this form of analysis. There are very few standards or set ways of doing things and set techniques. As I said at the beginning, I kind of feel I'm in a dark room and feeling my way around and still getting it wrong sometimes. But again, we could see that as maybe an opportunity for people who want to kind of come into this field and make a mark in it, because there's so little that's actually being done, which is good. What I'm going to talk a bit about on Friday relates again to this third point, this idea that as the tools become more sophisticated, the sorts of analysis that we can do will also become more sophisticated. We're very much tied, I think, to what the tools will let us do, and that can lead us down certain paths in certain directions, maybe which aren't always in the best directions. But we shouldn't assume that the software, the tools themselves, replace the human analysis. They make the analysis quick, and they can make it easy, but I hope I've shown that the tools themselves aren't the analysis, they're just maybe a way into an analysis. And we have to do an awful lot of work ourselves in sort of reading these concordance lines, trying to interpret and explain what's happening there. And we also have to make a lot of choices about what we do, how big is our corpus, what words do we look at, what approach do we take, do we do collocates or keywords or something else. So there's a lot of human input into this. It's not a quantitative form of analysis per se. I'd say it's qualitative, but it starts off using some quantitative techniques in order to make it a little bit easier for us.